I'm Connor Ruebusch, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Heavy Hands. I am Connor Ruebusch. With me is Patrick Wyman, and before we get into today's topics, which include a myriad of fights from UFC 214, we have to apologize, first and foremost, about some of the sound quality with this show. We've got some complaints over the years, and we'd love to make some changes, but recently the National Society for the for the Preservation of Historical Sites got in contact with us. And the show has been made a historical site. Boy, that was a real hard one to get through. Thanks, Pat, for sitting for sitting patiently while I fumble my way through that. Welcome to Heavy Hands. This is what you come to the show for just real professionalism. Today we're talking about UFC 214, as I said, and we really have two fights that we need to get to before all else. I'm talking, of course, about the main event, light heavyweight title fight, and a rematch between defending champion Daniel Cormier and Jon Jones, who held the belt himself the last time these two met and defeated DC. After that, we're going to talk about the welterweights, Robbie Lawler, Donald Cerrone, rescheduled blessedly from UFC 213 and brightening the middle of this particular main card. After that, in our final segment, we are going to cover just a few of the other fights in brief that we find interesting here. I'm talking about Jimmy Mano versus Volkan Oezdemir, talking about Ricardo Lamas versus Jason Knight, and of course, the catchweight fight between Aljamain Sterling and former bantamweight champion Renan Barão. Lots of good stuff to cover, and we will have a bonus episode coming out this week as well, so make sure you stay tuned to Heavy Hands. We've got a lot of good fight-related things to talk about. Jon Jones coming back. The promos.
One quick note: if you're wondering where in this show our analysis of Tyron Woodley versus Demian Maia and Tanya Evinger versus Cyborg is, it's not here. It's on last week's episode. So if you want to hear what we have to say about those fights, go back and check that out.
Good shout. Yeah, both the welterweight title fight and Cyborg's women's featherweight fight against Tanya Evinger, both exciting, both covered last week. So please do not miss that. Thanks for the reminder, Pat. Jon Jones. I've been enjoying the promos leading up to this fight. Jon Jones having quite the redemption story, although at this point it is difficult to really, I think, earnestly spin what Jones is going through as a redemption story. I think it's more like Jones just finding his truth has been the story of his career, getting into all these problems and everything and living recklessly. The first thing I want to talk about is just sort of the general X factors, the vagaries involved in this fight. The comments that Cormier made on that promo about how he thinks Jon Jones is a party boy, down to the core. And that when he's doing drugs and living crazily and not sleeping as much as he should and missing training sessions and just living this wild, disorganized life, Daniel Cormier thinks, or maybe he just says he thinks for promotional purposes, that Jon Jones is at his best only in that state. And that while he can ironically pretend to be happy for Jones now that he seems to be getting past some of his drug issues and things like that, he thinks he won't be the same fighter. Do you think, Pat, there's any merit to that idea? Do you expect Jon Jones, post the last 3 years, to come back looking the same or better?
I don't know if I expect him to come back and look the same, but I don't know if that's why. Mm-hmm. I do think that I think Cormier hit on something important, which is that Jon Jones is a package deal. Yeah. Right? You can't separate out the pieces of Jon Jones's personality that make him want to do bumps of cocaine in the days leading up to a 5-round title fight with a former Olympic wrestler and all-around dangerous guy, from the guy who makes incredible in-fight decisions and fights in both an incredibly measured and incredibly free kind of way. I don't think that you can separate those two things out. So yeah, I think that Cormier may be onto something there when he talks about how those two pieces are not separable. Jon Jones is not separable into different bins where you can just have Jon Jones, the awesome fighter, without Jon Jones, the impulsive risk taker. That's I think that's right. I think he's onto that.
Yeah, his idea seems to be, however, that Jones is going, now that he's like hiding that he can never get rid of that, so he's going to have to work hiding it, and that's going to make him look worse. I would suggest that was, if that's the truth, if this is the true nature of Jon Jones, this inseparability of these two dichotomous halves, then he was pretty good before we knew about all that stuff. He must have been hiding it then, right? So I don't have too much worry. I agree with you that that's probably not going to be the reason that Jones collapses, whether he's still engaging in that lifestyle or not. I have to imagine that he's got the mental composure to hang in there. But I'm interested to hear what ways in which you think he might look different, because I think that's the big question here in this fight. I mean, Jones hasn't fought, let's see what the time is now, has not fought since April of 2016. It's been well over a year at this point, and that fight happened well over a year after his last fight before that. So, and not a lot of people were, super pleased with Jones' performance over OSP. Even if it was dominant from a scoring perspective, people didn't feel that it really illustrated the best of Jon Jones. So what do you expect him to look like now after yet another 15-month layoff?
Well, so that's the rub to me, far more so than anything about Jones's personality or, whether he can be the same fighter if he's not engaging in wild, risky kinds of things outside the cage. I think that's the real thing, is what's Jon Jones going to look like now. He just turned 30. He's been fighting professionally for 9 years. He has not taken awesome care of himself in the way that other fighters have. Like, he has not, it's not like he has been consistently training in the offseason and putting in great strength and conditioning workouts and all that. Like, it would not really surprise me if Jones fell off simply because he has not been super tightly disciplined and doing all the great rehab work and everything that guys who tend to have exceptional longevity have done. On the other hand, he also doesn't have much wear and tear on him. He's taken almost no damage in his fights over the years. He's a tough dude. He's got a great chin. He's durable. Maybe not doing all of that stuff and just kind of showing up to camp, doing 3 months of training, and then fighting, and then going back to doing nothing for a while is going to end up benefiting him in the long run, because that's a lot less mileage on him. So there's that. But he looked rusty in the Ovent St. Preux fight. I don't think there's any way around that. Yeah. And that was after a 15-month layoff. He's now been off for another 15 months. With a lot of stuff that's happened in the interim, including a positive drug test. So if you were looking for reasons to think not everything is rosy for Jones heading into this fight, you would have good reason to do that. Whereas Cormier looks sharp. Cormier looks better than he ever has. He looks like he's made improvements. He's in great shape. The weight cut is always going to be a concern with Cormier, but you're not really worried about whether he's rusty, about whether his skills are going to be there.
Yeah, I think we should address the St. Preux fight for Jon Jones, because it has bothered me a little bit that, how public opinion, especially online, tends to go from one extreme to the other. And so the idea at first was, of course, Jones looked terrible. If Cormier fought this Jones, he would have beat him. DC himself said as much. And then the backlash came Jones won every round. So let's be realistic. At least he won every round, and then that, for a lot of people, that became Jon Jones looked great, and he didn't. He was not as comfortable as he normally is, and he attributed a lot of that to the weight training. But you have to imagine that layoff, that a guy who really seems to just thrive on living in the moment, living in the fight game to the fullest, it really affects him to not be. Even if he's I think he trained pretty hard for that fight, right? He did a lot of strength and conditioning. He was in the gym a lot. He was constantly posting videos, working with Brandon Gibson, looking sharp, but it did not show up in the fight. And I would say that something resembling the classic Jon Jones, the tenacity and the creativity we've come to expect from him, didn't show up until maybe the fourth round of that fight.
Yeah, I think it took a while for him to settle in. And, it was especially jarring because I think Jones has had fights where he has looked a lot like he looked in the OSP fight in terms of keeping it nice and slow, trying to keep the fight on the outside, just kind of picking apart, taking a little time to get into his rhythm. I don't think it would have looked quite as jarring if he hadn't looked so good in the Cormier fight. So if you're watching those fights back to back and you're trying to think, what is he going to look like for this? You go from the best performance of his career, hands down, where he looked amazing against Daniel Cormier in every way, tactically, strategically. His conditioning was fantastic. He just made the right decisions at every single point in that fight, to the OSP fight where looked not especially sharp. He was not producing a lot of volume. His triggers weren't that good. Like, he looked like he was kind of a step slow. It's especially jarring in that regard. I think if you went straight from the Teixeira fight or the Gustafsson fight to watching the OSP fight, it wouldn't be quite so. You would think, oh yeah, okay, that's Jon Jones.
It's like jumping back to a humbler, maybe less passionate version of the Rashad Evans fight. Which, it's not entirely out of place for Jones, but it was expected that he would do something more. And as you said, Cormier has been training. Cormier has been looking good. He's not had completely easy fights at all, but he's been making improvements. And what happened in their last fight was that Cormier, in the early going, was when he was winning or at least making rounds close. Here and there, people giving him rounds, him making Jones work for every round that he did win. That was when he was the biggest challenge. He had a hard time, as most people do, keeping up with the stamina, the conditioning of Jon Jones, and also just, I think, keeping up with that kind of evil determination that allows Jones to keep savaging somebody like Glover Teixeira long after his soul has clearly left his body. The
challenge that Cormier discovered in trying to fight Jon Jones is twofold, right? Like, first of all, there's the problem of range, which is there is exactly one range where you want to be against Jon Jones, and that's from a shorter person's kicking distance into the pocket. You don't want to be You don't want to be any longer than that. You don't want to be any shorter than that, because you don't really want to be in the clinch with him, at least not for any extended period of time. That's battle number one. Cormier did a pretty decent job at points of trying to collapse the distance and get into the pocket, but couldn't keep it in that space. Mm-hmm. Number two is you have to keep your eye on the strategic ball here. Like, you can't let yourself, as Cormier did in the second round of that fight, which was really the turning point, you can't let yourself get yourself into a position where you're trying to win battles and you end up losing the war. Yep. Like, that's what Jones is so good at. Even the one round that Cormier won, and I think it was still pretty dang close. Cormier only barely edged it. He was landing headshots in the clinch, but he was eating massive knees to the body in return. He was eating elbows in return. He was getting his gas tank drained. He was getting leaned on by Jones. Jones was burning stamina that he could afford to burn. Mm-hmm. Cormier was burning stamina that he could not afford to burn. So that's part of Jones's genius, is his willingness to give up a close round, in order to bank damage for later on in the fight that's going to pay off. Like, he did that a little bit against Alexander Gustafsson too. Like, he kind of laid back, did not really explode and put his everything into it. He just tapped away at Gustafsson's legs and body, and then when the moment came, he exploited it. So that's, I mean, if you're going to try to fight Jon Jones, you've got to find a way to overcome those two challenges. You have to find solutions to those two puzzles.
Mm-hmm. So if Daniel Cormier is having, as I think he did as well, he had like a big failure of strategy basically in that fight, where he was too focused on the individual exchanges and on making it close, making it a dogfight, as he said he wanted to do constantly, that he wasn't focusing on like what kind of dogfight he was allowing. Is there some way that you see, and we will consider Jones's potential ring rust in this, that Cormier in the rematch could make those victories maybe a little less Pyrrhic in nature, maybe take a fewer losses on the way to the fourth and fifth rounds, and absorb a little less attritive damage from Jones while still keeping the pressure on, because it does seem clear that he is going to have to put pressure on Jon Jones to beat him. I have a very hard time imagining Cormier drawing Jones in from his preferred range for a counter when Jones is, I mean, he doesn't really charge into the clinch, you know what I mean? He clinches when people come after him, but really when Jon Jones has his range, he's going to keep his range. So Cormier needs to pressure. He needs to get in Jones's chest.
Yeah, so this is what's really intriguing to me about Jones maybe having a little ring rust, maybe being a little less sharp than he was the first time they fought. If the version of Cormier had fought, or if the Cormier who showed up when they first fought had shown up to the time when they fought, when Jones fought Ovince St. Preux, I think Cormier would have won at least the first couple of rounds in that fight pretty handily, because
prolonged
Jones's
go on.
So Jones's, what was really notable about their first fight was how sharp Jones was right out of the gate.
Yeah.
Like, that Cormier tried to pressure him from the get-go. Cormier did the right thing in trying to get after him pretty much immediately. But Jones, right out of the gate, was ready to throw. Mm-hmm. He had his timing, he had his distance, he knew when to throw and when to move from the very beginning of that fight. And I think that Jones, who fought Ovince St. Preux, was not quite that sharp. from the very beginning of the
No,
fight.
not at all. The Jones who fought Cormier the first time was easily one of the most polished strikers we've seen. The way he was mixing up his shots off the left side, taking inside angles to set them up, the variety of his strikes, accepting the clinch when he and Cormier would clash on an exchange of punches or whatever. Like, everything was very smooth and well put together from the get-go. It was sort of like what we were saying about Jimmy Rivera, who fought last weekend. On last week's episode, we kind of pointed out that, like, his triggers are phenomenal from the beginning of the fight, and it throws a lot of people off. For Jones, I think he did that to Cormier, and if he can't this time, if he has to adjust to Cormier early, and Cormier basically comes out with some version of the same approach, Jon Jones losing rounds seems like a likely possibility.
So I think this is kind of a weird thing in this fight, is Cormier needs to stay in his face, but I don't think he needs to back him up to the fence.
Yeah.
Like, I think in this case, the fence actually kind of works to Jones's advantage, because if he can spin out and back you up, you do not want to have your back to the fence against Jon Jones, right? So if you back him all the way to the fence and he manages to clinch you up and turn you around, suddenly you're in a really bad spot. You're very much where you don't want to be. If you can stay within arm's reach of him in the middle of the cage, I think you're actually fine there. I think that's really a spot where you want to be. If you like, where you don't want to be is where he can just pin your hips against the fence and go to town on you. So, like, I don't know. I think, I'm not sure if there's a lesson to be learned there. Maybe if you're going to stay in Jones's face, you're going to have to force him to the fence. But it's worth bearing in mind. The whole point is just you need to walk the tightrope. You don't want to be in the clinch, and you don't want to give him opportunities to clinch. You want to punish him as you're getting out of the clinch. Like, you want to immediately get out and try to capitalize on that. But you mostly just want to be in punching distance where you can throw combinations and you're not worried about getting stuck on the end of his reach.
Yeah, you know what? Let's talk about, like, the tone of this segment seems to be like, can Cormier beat Jones, and if so, how? And I think that's kind of the narrative of this fight. Is like the promo is all about, can Jones re-become who he's supposed to be or whatever, re-fulfill his potential, or get back on the path to fulfilling his potential. And the flip side of that narrative is, can Cormier stop him? And what will that mean for him this time? And I'd like to talk about then maybe some of the, like, tactical adjustments Cormier could make between the first fight and this one to avoid it going the same way. We've already accepted that perhaps Jones will start a little slower this time. How does Cormier take advantage of that in order to keep Jones from doing what he did last time, which is just basically making 60% of the exchanges favor him more than they favor Daniel Cormier in those early tie-ups and exchanges?
Wait, so you mean what can Cormier do there?
Yeah, what's the tactical adjustment to avoid being, like, drawn into these clinch knees, besides just standing a certain way? Like, do you see anything in Cormier's pressuring game that you would hope would be different this time around? Things that really specifically hurt him in the first fight.
Do I see that, or is there anything that he can do? I mean, because those are two different questions. Are there things that he could do? Absolutely. Better footwork in the pocket. Like, keep your feet moving when you're at close range. Take angles at close range. Throw combinations. Pivot. Move to a new angle. Keep working. Keep your combinations going while trying to avoid getting drawn in the first place. I think it's going to be real hard, I think, for Cormier to make that adjustment, not because he's incapable of it, but because he is so used to being able to dive into the clinch at will and win those exchanges. Yeah. Like, so it's not Cormier is going to have to fight against his instincts to just tie up, because he's so used to winning there. Like, he fights really tall in the clinch. He fights much taller than he is. And whenever he's there, he's going to find himself in positions where Jones is going to be able to work his body and damage him and hit him with knees and elbows and just, like, do all the stuff that's going to take much more of a toll, like, probably on Cormier than on Jones.
Yeah, Cormier does stand very weirdly tall for a man of his stature in particular. He has very little bend in his knee, just seems to sort of walk around, has sort of an awkward, relaxed stance compared to most of his compatriots. But for me, I watched that first fight again, and I just don't like, and this goes for Cormier's fight with Gustafsson as well, I just don't like the way that he closes distance, Cormier. I admire how willing he was to do it in that Jones fight, but he does it in a way that I think just feeds into Jones's game. He does a lot of, like, hand covering, hand trapping kind of stuff, does Daniel Cormier. Reaches out, covers your hand, steps in with his head down behind that, And I think that's a longer man's game. Like, I think if you're going to cover somebody's hand and jab them to keep them from jabbing you back, you got to have pretty long arms. You can't just be reaching out for the fist of somebody who, in extending their arm, can then outreach you while your hand is away from your face. You know what I mean?
Well, but I think it works against pretty much anybody not named Jon Jones. That's what makes this tough for Cormier, is to beat Jones, he needs to do things that he normally wouldn't do.
Right.
And I think in this case, too, he needs to kick.
Oh, like, he had good success doing that in the first round of the last fight and kind of fell away from it.
Well, because he got a kick caught and got taken down.
Yeah, well.
And so then it kind of got into his head. But, like, a lot of this is just going to be sticking to a strategically sound game plan. In ways that, God damn it, Lucy. A lot of what Cormier needs to do, mother of God, that dog. A lot of what Cormier needs to do.
She is just waiting for you to talk.
Yeah. A lot of what Cormier needs to do. God, I swear to God in heaven.
We could take a break if you need to.
Just murdering me. Like, a lot of what Cormier needs to do here is just stick to a game plan and fight smart. And this is not to say that Cormier isn't a smart fighter. He is a smart fighter. But there's a difference between being a smart fighter and being Jon Jones. And when you fight Jones, you need to fight him perfectly. You cannot fall into his game. You cannot make little mental errors. Things like agreeing to dive forward into a clinch where you don't need to be. Things like that. Like, you cannot do that and expect to win a 5-round fight against Jon Jones.
Things like getting, having your ego wounded and getting into a takedown battle with a guy who is very difficult to take down and who has been taking you down several times. Like these kinds of things.
Like, what is your hope?
Right.
With like, you don't want to. You just don't want to be in that space with Jones because you're not going to hold him down. Yeah. Like, nobody has ever held Jon Jones down. Why would you build a game plan around taking him down and holding him down? You can't do that. Like, maybe you shoot for a takedown every now and again to keep him from getting comfortable on the feet, but you don't want to get sucked into that kind of fight. That's my concern with Cormier here, is how do you make that work? How do you keep it in the range where you're sure you have an advantage for the greatest amount of time without getting sucked into doing something that Jon Jones is better at than you?
So you think, that's interesting, man. It's so tough for Cormier because of Jones's clinch game. Like, he really can't. I mean, we don't want to talk about this too heavily. Like, Cormier can compete with Jones in the clinch better than just about anybody else in this division. He did so in their first fight pretty well. But like I said, like 60% of the exchanges in the first 3 rounds, most of the time, Cormier was on the losing end of those. But he's not a great pocket boxer, Like, it's kind of remarkable how competitive he made the first fight, considering how many advantages Jones just seems to automatically have over him. But I don't know. I'm still finding the fight like more difficult to pick than I think it should be, because I do not have a lot of faith in how Jon Jones is going to look after yet another layoff. Like, I just don't know where his head is at, and I don't know. Maybe there's something to DC's point. Maybe Jon Jones was best as a wild animal, and if he really is making an earnest effort not to be, then who knows? I don't know.
Yeah, I think Jones wins it. But I think Cormier is going to make it as tough as possible. So I don't know. I mean, I think probably 48-47 or 49-46 for Jones is the most likely outcome here. I mean, Jon Jones is, until proven otherwise, Jon Jones is still Jon Jones.
Yeah.
And everything that Jon Jones does at an absolutely elite level is so hard for Cormier. Like, and this is something that people did a lot leading up to the first fight, and I can sense it happening a little bit again here in the lead up to the second fight, is just strip away all of the personalities, strip away the trash talk, strip away is Jon Jones a better fighter when he's using cocaine and all that stuff. Strip that away. This is a hard stylistic matchup for Cormier because he's fighting somebody who's 5 inches taller than him with a 12-inch reach advantage, who can match him in the wrestling phase of an MMA fight, not in a pure wrestling match, but in the wrestling phase of an MMA fight, who has an incredible clinch game, who can fight well at distance. Like, just leave everything else aside, and that's incredibly tough. Like, it's when we start to weigh the other things, like, where's Jones's head at? Like, can he deal with Cormier's pressure? Things like that. Then it starts to look closer than I think it actually is. And when we read that stuff back onto the first fight, Jones outlanded Cormier by 34 strikes. over 25 minutes. He landed more than a strike a minute per round more than Cormier did. He stuffed practically all of Cormier's takedowns until the very end of the fight.
I mean, I think the thing is it's not a huge margin. Of all of Jones's fights, only the Gustafsson fight has had a sort of a narrower margin between how much Jones is effective and how much his opponent is.
But it wasn't that close. Like, this is crazy to put it this way. I've been beating this drum for a long time, and I'm going to do it one more time here in the lead up to this fight. That first fight was not that close. It was competitive. It was not close. What's your definition about who won 4 of the 5 rounds of the fight?
Yeah, but see, that still doesn't make it. That still doesn't make it one-sided. You know what I mean? That's still
no. But like, there's a difference between a fight being like, oh, this close back and forth battle. Like, Whitaker Romero was a close fight. You know what I mean? There are close fights out there. This was not that close. If you can end every round and be like, I know exactly who won that round. It was the same guy winning in different ways, dominating the other guy for long stretches of the fight. Like, it's just like, it was not. There's this desire out there to make Cormier out to have been Jon Jones's toughest challenge, and that's fine. Like, maybe he was Jon Jones's toughest challenge, except for a half-assed fight in training camp against Alexander Gustafsson. Mm-hmm. But with that said, we need to recognize how wide the gap still was. It's not like Cormier was 2 punches away from winning against Jon Jones. It's not like, oh, if he'd just done this one thing differently, he would have won the fight. No, man, he got beaten soundly for 20 of the 25 minutes of that fight, and even the round he won, he took so much damage to the body that it cost him the rest of the fight. Mm-hmm. Like, this is, I love Daniel Cormier. I love him as a fighter, but like, this is one of those fights where narrative has so captured how we view both guys and how we view the first time they fought and how we're viewing them the second time that they fought, that the desire to give Jones a credible rival and the desire to paint Cormier, frankly, as the hero and Jones as the villain in our conception of this, which is all natural stuff and it's great. I have no problem with it. It's what makes the sport interesting, but it drastically affects how we view what actually went on in the cage between the two of them.
Let me tell you why that worries me a little bit. I can't disagree with anything you said. Like I said, I think Jones won 4. You could give Cormier no more than 2 rounds, and I tend to agree that Jones took 4 and Cormier only got 1 in that fight. I do think it was competitive for the first 3 rounds, basically for every minute of every round. The margin, forgive me for thinking that 34 fights is not the largest 5-round fight margin I've heard between 2 fighters, and it does suggest somebody pulling away, in the later rounds. The thing is that with Jon Jones, it often feels as if we are compelled to pick by default. That it's like, well, I haven't seen Jon Jones lose yet, so what the heck? And it's tough to make Daniel Cormier that guy, which is why I'm also going to end up picking Jones, because default. But Cormier had this super competitive fight, and you get this weird feeling. It's almost like it's.
But you're doing it again, man. Like, it was not. It was.
We agreed it was competitive.
Don't make competitive close.
I just said competitive. He had a super competitive fight with Jones. That's what I said, Pat. Come on now, don't make me. I can
sense you edging this closer and closer in your mind. The more you talk about it.
Do not dress me in your straw man's clothes. All right, I'm just saying. The weird thing is that despite the competitiveness of the first fight, and it was easily one of Jones's most competitive, even if that still means Jones wins. Is that it's still hard to look at it and see like a clear path to victory for DC, because it's not like you're expecting him to knock Jon Jones out. He didn't really come close at all the first time. He landed some good shots early, and Jones took them without any issue. And Cormier had to fight for every single thing he got. You know what I mean? Like, Jones was the only guy in that fight getting free shots. Jones was the only guy in that fight who could hit Cormier and then move away from whatever was coming back at him. Whereas almost every single time Cormier landed, he had to move in and crowd and often take a return because he would end up standing so close to Jones. And like his footwork and his defense and that tall stance, those are liabilities in that range with a guy like Jones. So it worries me that there feels like no other option to pick Jon Jones. But looking at the first fight, there's just this weird feeling that, like, I even though I know that fight was very close, and I've rewatched it, and I still think it's close. I still think that that Cormier hangs in there and makes Jones work really hard for the first 2/3 of that fight. But at no point did he really seem to pull away with the fight, which is what I think you're saying. Like, he never stole the momentum from Jon Jones, and that is why it is very difficult always to pick against Jon Jones, because nobody steals the momentum from him. Like, he's always still just doing his thing, even if it's a lesser or more impressive version of that thing. So I have fears about how Jon Jones will look, and I always get like nervous with these are like the stories you read about in boxing history. Somebody goes crazy with their training life and everything collapses, blah, blah, blah. But it remains difficult, if not impossible, to pick against Jon Jones until he loses.
Yeah, I mean, like, this is something that we spent a fair bit of time at the beginning of this segment talking about, which is, what does a successful game plan from Daniel Cormier look like in this fight, right? And we talked about their first fight, and we talked about the things that Cormier did successfully.
Right.
He pressured. He got in Jones's face. He landed good shots in the clinch. When they clinched, like in the first 2 rounds of that fight, he landed some good shots. He used really good wrist control. He landed nice combinations with his offhand. He did a good job with a collar tie when he could reach up high enough to grab one. Like, he did good work. He landed some good kicks. Like, he gave Jones the right stuff to give himself the best possible chance of winning that fight early, and it still wasn't enough, right? Yeah. That's what makes this so tough, is it's not like you can point to a couple of adjustments and say,
right,
that's
what I was trying to get at before, asking, like, are there any tactics you can think of? Like, is there something that Cormier can do? And I guess what I was feeling was that the conclusion I just came to, that, like, nothing was easy, nothing was free for Cormier in that fight. Even though he made a lot of smart moves, he was the only one of the two in the cage that night who did not get to easily accomplish anything. This was one thing that stood out to me, because I talked to him right before he and Jones were supposed to fight again at UFC 200. Yeah. After what was supposed to be their rematch had gotten postponed, we had like a 20-minute conversation, and it was pretty much all technical stuff about how he viewed Jon Jones and how he viewed his style evolving and what he was doing in training. And like, it was one of the best conversations I've ever had with a fighter about their game and about how they view an upcoming opponent. And he seemed to think that he could get inside with that while taking less damage. After rewatching that first fight probably 6 or 8 times now, he did not take a lot of unnecessary shots. He took kind of the shots that he needed to take to get where he was going to go. He wasn't like standing at range and letting Jones hit him for no good reason, like OSP did when they fought. You know? I mean, he could have. There are certainly fighters throughout history who have closed distance more safely with more defensive responsibility. But Daniel Cormier, again, he's not a fundamentally sound, technical, traditional boxer. He's not going to come in slipping and rolling with a cross-armed guard to defend his body as he comes in low and then angles off in the pocket to land a left hook. You know what I mean? Like, that's not going to happen.
He's not that dude. But the whole thing is comparing Daniel Cormier to himself. It's not like there were things that we have seen Daniel Cormier do in the past that he could have easily done to avoid shots that Jon Jones was landing on him. You know, so that's kind of the hard part here, is it's not a matter of pointing to 1 or 2 adjustments that, like, oh, if he just does this, he'll be in better shape. It's an aggregate thing. Yeah. You know,
so it's a strategic thing. It's like a big picture thing. Like, how does Cormier win the fight?
Yeah, because, like, let's say hypothetically that Cormier really tightens up his defense and really tightens up his footwork and approaches the first fight exactly the same way, and he gets hit way less, right? He still probably loses on volume. He still probably gets hit 15 more times than he hits Jones.
You think
over a 5-round fight?
If he's defending more, he lands less?
Yeah, no, I mean, like, that Jones, let's say Cormier gets hit 25 less times in that fight, he still probably loses a decision.
Yeah, maybe.
That's the crazy thing, is like, that's what I meant when I said the margin was not actually that close. Like, and that's why I mentioned.
That's why I balk at it. Like, that's why I balk at it. Like, for DC's sake, I know it's not. I know it was competitive. I know he hung in there, and it just sucks to say, like, oh, he didn't win that fight. But you can concretely say, like, oh, there's no way Daniel Cormier won that fight. It was not. for being the second hardest fight of Jones's career, it was not even close to as difficult to score, I think, as the Gustafsson fight. Where
that's all I was trying to get at with the competitive versus close thing.
Yeah, no, I'm with you.
One strike per. Well, yeah, I mean, like you take away 1 strike per minute that Jones lands, and he still probably wins the fight. Like that's the kind of that's all I was trying to get at with that. Is if you take away 1 strike per minute from Robert Whittaker in the Yoel Romero fight, he probably doesn't win a decision.
Or like 1 strike away from Jimmy Rivera against Tomas Almeida.
And he probably doesn't win a decision. Right, That's what I mean with the difference between a competitive versus a close fight. Yeah. Like where how close is the actual margin of victory? That's I wouldn't mean to get DC to get fired up about it, but this is one of those times where that distinction kind of matters.
Oh, you're good. The people love passionate Pat, which is what they've taken to call you. I don't know if you've ever picked up on that. You're passionate Pat now.
I have picked up on that, and you can thank my son waking up between 5 and 6 every morning for the last 6 fucking months for that. I have no patience
for the last 6 months of quote unquote passion. Man, there was something I was going to say there. Cormier, what were you saying? Hold on. Cormier landing fewer shots. I don't know, man. The fight gives me pause, and part of that is perhaps some personal attachment to Daniel Cormier, who is obviously, while not as fascinating as Jon Jones, much easier to root for, a much more sympathetic character. But it's just hard to see a path to victory. Like, it's hard to see competitive. This is what I was going to say. Competitive is making it a fight, but close is making a case for a win. And if that's kind of like sums up what you were saying, your distinction. And it is very difficult to see Cormier making this fight truly close, because I can't imagine him getting enough exchanges where Jones doesn't pay him back in kind that he doesn't slow down first. I mean, the man's 39 years old, right? Like, Jon Jones is now an old man at 30, but unless the ring rust is really terrible, it's very hard to pick against him. So that was way more than we intended to do for this first segment, but that's all right. It was an interesting discussion. Both of us going for Jon Jones to regain his title. I'm sure both of us will be pleased if DC wins. A very affable sort of fellow, wouldn't you say, Pat?
Oh, yeah. Oh, I have to make one note on this. So if anybody hasn't read the incredible profile that Greg Howard, then of Deadspin, now of the New York Times, did on Jon Jones before that first Jones-Cormier fight, it's called How Jon Jones Became the Baddest Motherfucker on the Planet or on Earth. Read it, because it's incredible. And I don't want to blow up his spot or anything, but I know Greg has been working on a similar kind of story on Cormier leading up to this fight. So keep your eyes peeled for that this week. I think it'd be in the New York Times Magazine, but it should be coming out at some point. I know he's been on it for a while. Yeah, so just keep your eyes peeled on that. If you want to get into the kind of broader meaning of Jon Jones and Daniel Cormier, like Greg, I think is one of the best journalists working, period, in regardless of field. And if he chooses to turn his attention to Daniel Cormier, we should all be paying attention.
Yeah, he's one of those rare journalists who combines like great investigative and interviewing skills with fantastically literary writing. That is not like Ponzi or difficult to get through. We've recommended that piece a few times in the past, but it bears repeating because it will make you very compelled by the character and life of Jon Jones.
It's literally, I think, the best.
It's one of my favorite things. It's one of the best things I think I've read about the sport, at least.
Yeah, I'd say it's in the top 5 articles that have ever been written about the sport of MMA. Wow. That's my considered take.
All right. Well, Greg, you can send the check in the mail, and for all those readers we just sent your way, and we will see you all next segment. We're going to come back, and we're going to have to tighten up, unfortunately, but we have to get to that welterweight clash, Robbie Lawler versus Donald Cerrone. We will be getting to that incredible, blood-pounding, curdling, thirsty fight after this. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it. And we are back. Robbie Lawler, Donald Cerrone. We got the former welterweight champ making his return. I think it's been over a year now since Robbie Lawler lost that belt to Tyron Woodley. Let's check Wikipedia real quick. Yeah, back in July, almost a year, back in July of last year. And it's been a sad state of affairs with Brutal Bob out of the picture. Pat, I really have missed him, I gotta be honest.
Yeah, no, Robbie Lawler, I think, is one of both your and I's favorite fighters to watch.
Oh, yeah.
I know we were both just crushed by the way he fell to Tyron Woodley last July. That was incredibly sad. Also because it didn't really give us all that much to analyze as a fight. Like, it's not like it was this great back and forth war where we could like appreciate Brutal Bob. He just got hit with a vicious right hand and like got his head dribbled off the canvas. Like, yeah. I had my cold comfort back then, Pat. I will remind listeners that I picked Tyron Woodley to win that fight by first round KO, so I at least had the cold solace of smugness to carry me through what was indeed a dark time. Robbie Lawler, man, is like one of the most unlikely championship runs. His story, which came shortly after, like Mark Hunt's big breakthrough in the UFC, was basically the perfect culmination of that Mark Hunt story. Got to the title, defended it, put on amazing, thrilling fights, some of them controversial, some of them close, but all of them absolute classics. And now he's in here against Donald Cerrone, who has revitalized himself as a welterweight fighter, but not enough to beat everybody in front of him. Some of the same flaws that stung him in the past showed up again in the Jorge Masvidal fight. Granted, he was also in there against one of the better incarnations of Jorge Masvidal, who just boxed Cerrone's ears off. If we both agree that boxing is probably still, like pressure in boxing is probably still the best way to get to Donald Cerrone, do you think that Robbie Lawler is going to be able to deliver that? And if not, what do you expect to see from him? I have a real hard time knowing what to expect in this fight from both sides, if we're being honest about it. We have been waiting for the other shoe to drop with Donald Cerrone for a long time, considering his activity level and how much time he spent in camp. And getting rocked by Jorge Masvidal, who is not who's dangerous, but not like a huge puncher, getting rocked multiple times by him is not a great sign, especially after getting rocked multiple times by Matt Brown in their fight. Like, if you were looking for reasons to think like, okay, Cerrone is probably going downhill, you would have things to point to. On the other hand, though, Robbie Lawler didn't do a whole lot of anything against Tyron Woodley. Really did not look like himself against Carlos Condit. Looked a step slower, looked like his triggers were off, really got taken out of his game plan pretty early in that fight. If you wanted to look back at the Rory McDonald fight, it took him a couple of rounds to get uncorked and really start landing shots. Even though that turned into an epic fight, I did not think until a certain point that was a great Robbie Lawler performance. So it's really been since the second Johnny Hendricks fight, 2.5 years, coming up on 3 years now, where Lawler has really, really looked good. Really looked like spot on with himself. So those are, and bear in mind too, the McDonald fight was a pretty favorable matchup for Lawler. That was a fight where McDonald is not a tremendously high volume striker. Like, he works at a good clip, but not an outstanding one. He is a good wrestler, but he really depends on his top game. Like, he's not like an incredibly explosive athlete. That was a pretty solid matchup for Lawler, and it really took him until the end of that fight to take over. So these are not like fantastic signs in that regard.
No, in a 3-round fight with Cerrone, like there are basically two things we've seen from Lawler at several points throughout his career, but also in this recent run, that would be risky choices of strategy against Cerrone. If Lawler comes into this fight, tied to any one strategy, because it seems sometimes that he's not. But either Lawler does like what he did to Johnny Hendricks in their second fight, comes after him like a maniac early, and tries to put a stamp on the fight. He did that likewise, I think, to Jake Ellenberger or maybe Rory McDonald. There's somebody else that he came out and stunned early. And then with only 2 more rounds to go, sort of takes his foot off the gas. So we know Lawler to be a guy who maybe gets bored or frustrated or just sort of runs out of ideas, but there are times in fights when he is very content to just wait, and often that comes after a big salvo. So maybe he's just recovering his energy. But that would be risky, because while Cerrone is a famously slow starter and vulnerable to pressure and boxing early, he's also a pretty good comeback artist. Like, Cerrone is one of those guys who, when you don't stop him early, or you don't keep him on Queer Street for a long time, he tends to soldier back into the fight. Even in that infamous loss to Nate Diaz, Donald Cerrone was in there chewing up Nate's legs at the final bell. Even in his first loss to Rafael dos Anjos, Cerrone may have won the 3rd round of that fight. So you don't want to just pour everything in there and then take your foot off the gas for the rest of the bout, because Cerrone's tough enough and determined enough not to just get put away in the first. The other option is the other like main thing we've seen from Lawler is what he did in the things you mostly just described. The slow starts with the little bursts and then the desperate surge in the 5th round. He's not going to have the 5th round here. Although he did do a 5th round Robbie Lawler surge in that first fight with Rory McDonald. It just happened in the 3rd. But he can't afford to give Donald Cerrone a ton of time at the beginning of the fight. You know what I mean? Like, he can't afford to be put off of pressure or to be chased out of the pocket. He can't afford to take his time figuring out how he's going to deal with Donald Cerrone, because that is when Cerrone's dangerous. When you're guessing what he's going to throw next, when you're standing at his range, he mixes up his strikes phenomenally well and knows how to pour it on when he senses you flagging. So, I don't know. I'm a little worried for Brutal Bob here, if I'm being honest. I'm a little concerned.
I'm a little less worried, just because I think, take a step back, right? What is the basic dynamic of this fight? Brutal Bob is still a tremendously hard puncher. He still carries ridiculous pop in his hands. And Cerrone is both hittable and a guy who, as we discussed, is probably not taking shots as well as he used to. Mm-hmm. And he never took shots fantastically well. No. Right? So if we have a less durable guy against a guy that we know still has tremendous pop in his hands, I think we have to bear that in mind as the baseline dynamic, and then build everything outward from there in terms of how we analyze the fight.
I mean, if we criticize Robbie for the Carlos Condit fight, let us not forget the 2nd round, in which any man but Carlos Condit would have been beheaded by the left hand that Robbie Lawler landed.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if that shot hits Donald Cerrone, his head is bouncing over Greg Jackson's head and into the stands.
His head is landing in John Anik's lap if Robbie Lawler lands that shot.
Yeah, so I think we have to bear that in mind here as the baseline thing around which everything else rotates. Mm-hmm. Robbie Lawler is going to land shots. Can Donald Cerrone take those shots long enough to get his game going? Or, because I think Donald Cerrone could finish Robbie late too if he piles on the volume and really gets his kicking game going. Like, I could see him kicking Robbie Lawler's head off. That's for sure a thing that could happen in this fight. He's a creative striker. He's gonna there are openings in Robbie Lawler's defense. We talked about the kind of subtle creativity of Lawler's defensive game and how he adapted to just getting hit less and less severely over the years, rather than like turning into a totally different fighter. Mm-hmm. But if you give Cerrone the time to throw 15 shots a minute, he's going to land a lot of them. You know?
Yeah, that's the thing, is that Lawler as a fighter is a celebration of defense, because he's an offensive fighter. So like the defense works in perfect concert with what he does as a fighter. These little shifts and rolls and slips and getting his hands up to block and countering. He counters off of these things and moves forward and attacks off of these things. He's not a defensive stylist. If he stands around in this fight and lets Donald Cerrone start to put his strikes together, if he's trying to pick them off as they come in, there's a very good chance Cerrone knocks him out. Rory McDonald almost did it with a similar kind of situation. So did Carlos Condit. Donald Cerrone's striking is very dangerous and very well schooled and getting better under the tutelage of Brandon Gibson. So it's a weird fight in which Lawler seems to have the one really big advantage, but in which Cerrone, in which he may have to fight like that. I don't want that puncher's chance to be his saving grace. You know what I mean? I don't want that power to be the only thing that keeps him in this fight. If I see that, then I will be dreading the next Robbie Lawler fight. You know what I mean?
Well, what's going to win this fight for him? I think not so much the power as his ability to stick in the pocket and counter.
Yeah,
like
I'm hoping
to not give ground when Donald Cerrone comes at him, trying to back him off with flashing hands and then move into a kick. It's going to be Lawler lobbing a kind of an arcing right hook over the top of Cerrone's jab and hitting him right on the chin.
Yeah, but I also think that Robbie's going to get hurt in this fight, man. Like, I can see Robbie doing that thing he does where he goes for that hook and, like, shells up and ducks down low, and it happens to be a knee from Cerrone that he just bends right into. I don't know. Cerrone throwing those combinations, putting his strikes together, does worry me. If Lawler's looking for the counter, that's the hardest situation in which to counter, is when somebody is not just throwing single shots. And these days, Cerrone rarely does.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to take Lawler here for the reasons that we pointed to. I think just the basic... If Lawler touches him more than a few times, I think Cerrone is going to be in real trouble. Also, Lawler, real underrated body work.
Oh, yeah.
Real good body shot artist, and that has been a problem for Cerrone for years now. Like, Lawler throws a tremendous liver kick and a tremendous left hand to the body when he goes for it. I think we're going to see a little more of a high-volume Lawler in this fight. I think he's going to be less concerned about maintaining his gas tank and getting tired. It's because it's given that it's 3 rounds. I think Cerrone is going to give Lawler the kind of fight in which Lawler can thrive. I don't think Cerrone knows how to fight a safe fight, you know?
Yeah, no. He's a guy who is known for kind of shooting himself in the foot. And it maybe even, I've suspected over the years that maybe it's overtraining. You seem to see this pattern in Cerrone's career where he has a bunch of fights in a row, he looks really good, and then he gets to the big one at the top and falls. And it's either because he doesn't rest or because there's too much pressure, maybe. Hasn't Robbie Lawler been working with Henry Hooft before this fight?
Yeah, I believe he's working at Hooft's new gym. I think it's called Combat Club.
Yeah, Hooft and Gilbert Burns. Okay, well that settles it. Yeah, the idea of another late career resurgence for Robbie Lawler under Henry Hooft fills me with childlike glee, and I'm going to assume that is exactly what we will get. And that will be how Robbie Lawler beats Cerrone. But I am very nervous about it. I think Cerrone is a super live dog in this fight. And now he has had, if time management is a factor for him, now he's had 5 or 6 months to recover from that Masvidal loss. So he may once again begin one of those famous Donald Cerrone winning streaks. Who knows?
I think if this goes to a decision, I think it's almost certainly going to be the fight of the night. I think it's more likely, frankly, that either guy finishes the other.
Yeah.
Than that it goes to a decision. I think either Lawler early or Cerrone late. I think Lawler early is maybe a little more likely. So that's my pick. There's caveats there. I think we laid that out. I could easily see how Cerrone wins this fight. I think, again, we can't overstate how much better Cerrone has gotten in the last couple of years. It's really impressive to hit up against some real rough spots in your career, revamp your game, build kind of a whole new gym around yourself, and come back a better fighter. That's not common. A lot of guys would just kind of stick to the same stuff and grind out a few more wins and call it a career. Cerrone has not done that. Credit to him.
Yeah, and while the same sort of ancient flaws that have always haunted him were at the core of his loss to Jorge Masvidal, compare that to the other guys who have beaten Cerrone with that kind of style. You know, like Masvidal, even compared to Nate Diaz, who we of course have a lot of respect for, way faster, more direct with his hands, harder to hit, more agile. He dealt with Cerrone's offense a lot more efficiently than Nate Diaz did, which suggests that Cerrone is, he's fighting a new level of striker now, even as his own striking continues to develop. It's not as if, because he's losing for some of the same reasons, that he's not getting better. Jorge Masvidal was, pretty dangerous that night. Let's take a break one more time. When we come back, we're going to get to those 3 other fights that we mentioned at the top of the show. We've got Jimmy Manuwa versus Volkan Oezdemir, Ricardo Lamas versus Jason Knight, and Aljamain Sterling versus Renan Barão after this. Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are 1 or 2 of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. And you can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show. And we are back. I'm still thinking about that beginning of the show, Pat. Still thinking about that intro. It was my worst. It's my worst yet.
I'm not gonna blow smoke up your ass, Connor.
I mean, can I be past my prime already? Is that possible? I had
I don't know.
Such a short and bright flame. I had a couple of winners that you really liked, and now all down the drain. So goodbye to all of our listeners.
Let's definitely dwell on it and talk more about it to really figure out where we stand here.
Which, by the way, I should say is the most divisive aspect of our show. Is that some people hate the fact that we ever bring up that anything goes wrong, and some people insist that we basically only talk about our own insecurities about the failures of the show. So it is what it is. But boy, I got to do better than that next time. That's the only reason I bring it up. I have to embolden myself for a comeback win. Let's talk about Jimmy Manuwa versus Volkan Oezdemir. As much as we can. Volkan Oezdemir, here's the thing. Oezdemir has now what appears to be a very strong case for a high ranking in this division. And if you were to beat Jimmy Manuwa, I would say one of, if not the strongest case in the division for a title shot against whoever the new champion is. But it feels really strange to say that because he has shown us very little in his 2-fight UFC career to suggest that he is really ready for that level of opposition or that he ever will be, right?
Yeah, sorry. I mean, I'm trying to think of how to put this without sounding crazy. I think Oezdemir is actually he has some really good skills. He's a pretty good kickboxer. He throws nice combinations. He's got some pop in his hands. He works at a really good pace. He's aggressive. He's kind of a prototypical Henry Hooft fighter, which is awesome. I think we should all be happy to have more of those guys in the light heavyweight division.
He's Henry Hooft's Chad Laprise, the less renowned fighter who really exemplifies what they like to teach.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it. And he's and in that sense, he has passed the victory against Jimmy Manuwa. Unfortunately, what that means for Oezdemir in this matchup is that he's going to spend a lot of time in ranges where Manuwa can hit him much harder than Oezdemir is going to hit him. Mm-hmm. And either Oezdemir is going to find a way to make it into the third round and win on volume, or he's going to eat just a fucking brutal left hook and find himself sleeping. And I think that the latter is more likely. I think it's more likely that due to spending time in ranges where Manuwa is going to be able to hit him and hit him clean, move his shots around his guard, under his guard, pick and choose his shots here and there, I think it's likely that Oezdemir is gonna wind up sleeping.
Yeah, I like what I've seen from Jimmy Manuwa lately. He has he's not reinvented his game by any stretch, but he has certainly tightened it up, I think. He has just closed the gaps between the different, pieces of his arsenal that he likes to use. One thing I like most is that he's really reinvested in his jab. Maybe this is recency bias. I haven't counted, but it really feels like against Anderson and OSP that Jimmy Manuwa was using his jab a lot more than he ever did before. And while he doesn't paw with it and touch with it, he doesn't use 6 different varieties of jab like some of the best, most educated left-handed fighters do. But he makes people real jumpy with it. Manuwa hits hard and moves very fast. And when he snaps somebody in the face with that jab, I mean, A, it must feel like your nose and your orbital have just been smashed if he connects squarely. But B, it allows him to then load up on his big strikes. Left kicks, left hooks, overhand rights off of those two. These more Tyson-esque sort of ripping circular shots. Those are what Manuwa does really well. But it's only because of the jab that he's able to get to that range. He doesn't bridge the distance with the jab, is what I'm trying to say. But by threatening it, he can then bridge the distance with some measure of security. And I think that kind of stuff is going to matter a lot against Oezdemir, who, he does have some basically good skills, but has looked decidedly unremarkable in his 2 UFC fights, not entirely due to reasons of his own making. No one can fault him for accidentally knocking Misha Serkinov out with a knuckle wrap on the back of the ear. It's certainly not his fault that he didn't really get to show what he was capable of in that fight. And the short notice fight with OSP was impressive that it was a win, and yet looking at it, it's hard to feel that either guy really showed, I don't know, something amazing. So if we look at this fight and the difference between OSP and the elite of the division seems to be, to me, like agility, athleticism, explosiveness, just these kind of intangible things that, like that speed wall, the power wall that he's going to run into. I think Jimmy Manuwa was a pretty good representative of that kind of fighter. That there's just going to be too much a difference in athletic ability for Oezdemir unless he can survive a lot of punishment and get to the third round. And even then,
it's not like he's not a tough guy. I mean, we know he can take good shots, but when you're getting hit by somebody like Jimmy Manuwa, like, you had better have an absolutely elite chin. You had better be able to take, like, that is one of the hardest punches that you're gonna be forced to take. And I think until we see him deal with that and deal with the kind of crisp one-shot technique and timing and in general speed that Manuwa brings to the table, it's hard to pick him there.
Yeah, and that's my point talking about Manuwa's increased use of the jab, and I think the idea that he can just bridge that gap a little more effectively now. The big thing for him, I think, is getting in distance to use the strikes with which he is most dangerous, and now he has at least one way to do that he didn't necessarily have when he first came to the UFC. Oezdemir maybe has some new skills that he didn't have when he first came to the UFC, but again, it's really hard to say, and nothing has looked particularly impressive. You can't say that for Jimmy Manuwa's recent performances, so I'm going to go with Manuwa. I think a first-round KO, possibly a second-round KO or TKO feels about right to me.
Yeah, I think inside the distance is the pick here.
Yeah. Let's talk about Lamas and Knight then. Both of us have been very high on Jason Knight, and he justified those feelings in his last fight, which was once again an absolutely bananas, not even necessarily a war, a fight that Jason Knight slowly worked his way into and took over, but it's always a thriller with Knight. And he seems like sort of a Justin Gaethje type to me in that I keep feeling like his ceiling must be just within reach, and then he just shatters through where I expected him to stop. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, well, because I think, and this is maybe something that biases us strangely against exciting fighters, like guys who tend to fight with that kind of style, is that we underestimate how much better they can get.
Yeah.
Like there's a tendency to think like, well, they've got to be close to hitting the limits of what they're capable of because their fights are competitive, Like that fight with Alex Caceres was really competitive. The fight with Chaz Skelly was really pretty dang competitive. His fight with Jason Knight's fight with Dan Hooker was competitive. So if you're having competitive fights with like mid-tier guys, then I understand why that's the case. And I think you hit the nail on the head. That's very true of Gaethje too. Like if you're having a competitive fight with Luis Palomino, like are you really going to be able to destroy Michael Johnson? Those are valid concerns to have. Mm-hmm. But in Knight's case, and in Gaethje's case too, I think they're fairly similar in that regard, is they're making consistent improvements. They are getting better. They're having competitive fights, but they're competitive with increasing levels of competition. And so I think the question here is, knowing what we know about Ricardo Lamas, because I think we have a pretty good idea of who and what he is as a fighter, can you see Knight having made the kinds of improvements in the last 2.5 months that are going to make him competitive with a guy like Lamas? Yeah,
what kind of improvements would those have to be? Against Lamas, I imagine it would be nice for Knight to have worked on his kick defense, for him to perhaps have worked on his defense a little overall and worked on closing the distance. I assume that Knight's going to want to come after Lamas here. But also I imagine he'd have to have worked on maybe his wrestling, because it didn't work out against Chaz Skelly, and I have a hard time working out against Ricardo Lamas, pulling guard and controlling the other person. And also it has to be said that in that Knight fight, that Skelly-Knight fight, Skelly was weirdly complacent when Knight was controlling him from his back. He kind of let Knight off the hook, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Well, they're much different kinds of control artists on the mat. Lamas is much more violent from top position than somebody like Chaz Skelly is. He is much less dependent on scrambles. He can control you for long periods. And I think, frankly, he's much more dangerous as kind of a one-shot, one-kill guy when you scramble with him, right? Like if you give your neck in a transition as you're trying to get back to your feet. Lamas can finish you there. With Skelly still needed to get to your back at that point.
He's a scrambler, but it's also a lot of grinding from him.
Yeah, and Lamas is not that dude. Lamas can either control you from the top for long periods while doing tremendous amounts of damage. Like, if Lamas gets on top of Knight, he's going to elbow his face off.
Oh, yeah. I remember with Fear, the blood pulling in Eric Koch's eye socket after Ricardo Lamas smashed his face open on the ground with a few standing right hands.
Yo, yeah. It is.
It's one of his underrated talents. I think he's got a real knack for beating people up when they're lying flat on their backs.
Yeah, I mean, I think Lamas has been one of those guys that maybe you and I have underrated a little bit over the years because he doesn't fit in really precisely to what we tend to look for in fighters.
Oh yeah,
you know? Because I think you and I kind of have trouble with opportunists, like really, really good opportunists, and understanding when and how their games are going to work right. And Lamas is very much that guy. Like he finds opportunities to finish the fight, and his killer instinct is just off the charts. Like if you give him an opening, the fight is probably going to be over. Jason Knight is going to give him openings. You know, I think that's what makes this a really intriguing matchup. Knight is going to give him chances to land big punches, big kicks on the mat. He's going to find chances to land good ground and pound and to grab a neck in transition. Those chances are going to be there. The question is whether Lamas can make the most of them and finish the fight.
Yeah, because if we're talking about who has like the process in this fight, who feels like their game has more of a consistent direction to it, I think it has to be Jason Knight. Even if that game is a little less developed, maybe doesn't quite have the same nuance that Lamas has. Lamas is the opportunist. The reason that those guys have always befuddled us is because, as we've covered a few times now in the past few episodes, we're kind of suckers for process. We're suckers for the idea that you can build a victory piece by piece, that you can build a game plan piece by piece and just sort of categorically accept or strike off certain elements of your skill set that will or won't work against this given opponent. And Lamas definitely takes different approaches to different opponents. He definitely has some guys he wants to stay away from, and some guys he wants to pressure, and so on and so forth. Some guys feels he needs to wrestle, and yada yada yada. But it's very difficult to know like what the elements are determining Lamas's strategy for any given fight, and his ability in a lot of fights where he has these long stretches of looking somewhat unremarkable. His real talent seems to be being an opportunist, and it's a really hard thing to quantify. It's just somebody who sees an opening and immediately puts themselves in the right position to capitalize on it, and often those openings are fight-ending opportunities, and it's really difficult to quantify what makes Lamas so good at that particular skill. He's not the only guy in the sport, or in combat sports in general, with that knack, but these are the guys that always sort of worry me picking against them, and I'm not sure that I can pick against Lamas here, because Knight is really straightforward, but almost in a way that makes him feel kind of trapped in this fight. He's kind of locked onto some rails, and Lamas's rails might be all over the damn place. That could work for or against him. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I do. So kind of with that in mind, how do you see this going? Like, because to me, I think Knight is going to probably be getting the better of it on the feet. I think when they scramble, Lamas is going to find opportunities. Like maybe Knight is just that good on the mat. It's entirely possible, but we've seen Knight get controlled from the top before, and I think Lamas is going to be the most dangerous top control specialist he's ever fought. So if the fight gets into those positions, and I think it will, then you gotta like Knight there. But also Lamas's takedown defense isn't impenetrable. Like he's been taken down by pretty much everybody who's tried to.
That's true.
And Knight in top position is a hell of a dangerous guy.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. Yeah, because Knight is going to be the one giving himself opportunities. You have to imagine that even if the fight starts a little slow, that Knight is most likely going to consent to be the one pressuring and swarming in this matchup. Lamas is probably going to move around, try to peck him off with kicks and pot shots, and shoot in for a takedown when he gets over aggressive. But as we were saying, Knight is like, aggressive fighters are not dumb fighters. That's a big thing for us, and we both of us know how evolved an aggressive style of fighting really can become. So just knowing that Knight is like a little straightforward and a little reckless is not enough to think that he can't make that work against Lamas. I think it would require Knight to have made some substantial improvements from the last fight. And
which it's entirely possible that he is. He seems to be making really rapid improvements in his game, showing new craft. Like, he's still not great defensively, but the pace that he works at and the way that he makes his aggression go kind of minimizes the risk to him in some meaningful way.
Yeah, I think I might take Jason Knight here. I think I might take Jason Knight because I just like his aggression. Like, I have not yet seen anybody who can make him change his mind about coming forward by landing a hard shot, which is often how Lamas finds his opportunities. He'll stun somebody and then jump on them or yada, yada, yada. And I don't think that Knight, because of the way he uses his jab and his long arms for his boxing, I don't think he's going to be as easy to take down reactively as Lamas expects. I think the pressure and the volume are going to give him a very, very slight edge. But I also think we may see him landing more cleanly, getting hit less frequently. Like, I'm hoping to see basically a better version of Jason Knight each new time that we see him, because he's clearly been growing from one fight to the next already.
Yeah. I mean, I think, God, you kind of talked me into it. I think I'm going to take Knight.
Yeah.
With the caveat that if Lamas subbed him with a guillotine in the first round, that would be like, I feel like that's the most likely single outcome of this fight is Lamas drops him or Lamas catches him in a scramble and snags the front headlock and finishes the fight.
Yeah.
But yeah, man,
that's the thing, man.
I think
but
it's
that's
either that or Knight wins kind of a late or Knight wins a decision.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, Ricardo Lamas is always capable of doing that. And he's done it so many times on a big stage, but you still never feel like you can count on it. You always think, like, how did he get there? Like, how did he get Dennis Bermudez to the ground with that jab and then take us back? It kind of feels like he got a little lucky, you know? He just got the opportunity and jumped on it better than anyone else. But if we're talking about, if winning a fight comes down to making opportunities, I think that's why I favor Knight. Yeah. And finally, catchweight bout. Aljamain Sterling, Renan Barão. Barão was not allowed to do what he foolishly, I think, wanted to do and go back to bantamweight for this fight. I think where's this card?
The California State Athletic Commission refused to allow this fight to take place at 135. If Barão makes 140 without any problems, then they said in the future they may license him at 135.
But honestly, I thought Barão looked pretty good at 145. I know his fights weren't going flawlessly, but I thought he was kind of trying to discover a new style that would work for him as the smaller, more mobile guy rather than, the bantamweight banger. And I guess the fights weren't easy enough for him, and so he wanted to go back to the place where, he's had some very easy fights in the past. But I don't like the idea of Barão sucking down. At least there's some forgiveness in that this is a catchweight fight. Either way, even if Barão was really drained from the additional 5 pounds of weight that he's lost, I do think it's a really hard matchup for Aljamain Sterling. Like, it almost so strongly that it feels like a bit of a fuck you to Aljo from the UFC. Like, we're just going to keep giving you the toughest guys we can think of without feeding you anybody whose name really means something in the division. You know what I mean? Like, here's tough fights that won't get you ahead.
Yeah. I'm a little perplexed, and I say this as a longtime fan of Aljamain Sterling. I like the guy. I've been following his career since he was very new to the sport. Mm-hmm. I wrote about him back in 2013, like a long time ago. And I'm a little puzzled with the fights that he's taken in the last couple of years. I'm a little confused as to what the thought process was. The Caraway fight was really high risk and pretty low reward. Even if he'd won that, it's not like he would have been much higher up the bantamweight chain.
Which Rafael Assunção's nickname might as well be high risk, low reward.
Yeah, and then Augusto Mendes, another pretty high risk and pretty low reward fight. Now here, I think I get the thought process, like, this is a former bantamweight champion, you win this fight and suddenly you're right there in the conversation at the top of the division, but do people really think of Renan Barão that way anymore?
Right, that's the thing. People have forgotten about Renan Barão. That's people think that he completely fell off after even the first Dillashaw fight. That the second fight was essentially just a period on the end of that sentence, and think that he's done. But he's, like, if you watch his fights, he's very clearly not. So his name means less, but he's really not that much worse from who he was when he was bantamweight champion. Like there's still a pretty close amount of parity between him and the top guys in this division. So it just seems like a really risky choice for Sterling. Like, wouldn't it have been safer for Sterling to take on like somebody like a Thomas Almeida is probably more popular these days than Barao because he has momentum and Barao feels like he doesn't.
Yeah, it's a weird decision. I mean, with that said, yeah, I don't think this is a real good matchup for Aljo. Like, I'm looking at the betting odds here, and Sterling is a -140 favorite.
Yeah, so Barao's still an underdog, huh?
Yeah, I mean, if he can't, so let's break this down. Like, if you're Sterling, what is your game plan here? Barao has incredible takedown defense. Like, he may actually have the best takedown defense in the sport, considering the guys that he's fought over the years. He has really exceptional takedown defense. He's a pretty high volume striker on the feet, puts together nice combinations, is a little prone to brawling, but if he gets into his rhythm, he can chew you up at distance. So what is Sterling's game plan here, given that he's at his best when he can take you down and work on the mat?
Box Barao up like he did Augusto Mendez, right? That's the problem here, is that I saw so many things I loved in Sterling's fight with Augusto Mendez. I loved the new commitment he had to throwing his hands. I love that he was throwing combinations. I love that he was using head movement to set up his shots. Everything was not perfect. It was very far from it, but it was clearly somebody implementing new skills, and specifically ones that you and I had been basically complaining for a year or more at that point, that were specifically skills he needed in his game. So that was great. Like, I'm like, all right, Aljamain Sterling back on track. We're going to see this guy. Oh, okay. So now we're going to put this novice boxing ability and this for a fighter who otherwise needs the takedown to beat somebody like Barao against, well, Barao, who is obviously a better striker and one of the hardest guys to take down in the UFC. In all of MMA, has some of the best takedown defense. Statistically better than Jose Aldo's. You know, like... he's given up one takedown in his combined WEC and UFC career, and that was to Anthony Leone in his first fight all the way back in, what was that, 2010, I want to say? So he has yet to give up a takedown in the UFC.
Correct. Yeah, 100% takedown defense in the UFC. And he's fought Uriah Faber twice. I fought TJ Dillashaw twice. Has not given up a takedown. Yeah,
and while I don't want to paint this too broadly, with Aljamain's current level of boxing ability, which again has a lot of the right building blocks, but just needs a lot of refinement still, with that, then 100% takedown defense in an opponent who is a very good, dangerous kickboxer kind of feels like you're saying 0% chance of Aljamain Sterling winning. Like, it really does not feel like he has a path here.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think he has a 0% chance of winning, especially because, I mean, yeah, but it does not favor him. I don't understand why he's the betting favorite here. Like, if I were just looking at this fight without any emotional investment in it and I were just laying it out, I'd be like, oh, Barao, UD, like 29-28 or 30-27, no problem. Like, and I wouldn't think it would be that close. Like, I could tell you what I think would be the strike stats in my head. It would be like Barao lands 62 strikes, Sterling lands 41. And Sterling goes like 0 for 6 on takedowns.
Sure. Even if he gets Barao down, he's also one of the better submission grapplers he's faced. Like, it's more like getting Rafael Assunção down than it is like getting Mizugaki down. You know, like Barao's got a legit jiu-jitsu game. So there's just too much shit in Sterling's way, man. It frustrates me because I was really excited to see him continue to grow and develop, but I'm pleased to hear, at least, since we didn't talk about this before the show, but we both basically seem to have come into this matchup with the same tone. It feels like a bad matchup for Sterling. I think it is. You said Barao, UD. I think that's what I'm going to go with.
Yeah, I mean, like, does Sterling have paths to victory? Yeah, absolutely. Especially if he puts his punches and kicks together with his takedown entries, gets Barao up against the fence, spins around to his back as he's getting Barao to defend takedowns. Like, he can control large chunks of this fight on the mat. I don't think he can finish it on the mat, though. Like, I would be real surprised if Sterling were able to finish this fight on the mat. And if he doesn't finish it, then he's going to have to deal with a guy who is a higher volume striker on the feet, who is a better kind of technical striker at most of those ranges, who can match or exceed his pace. Like, that's a tough matchup. I mean, I like Sterling a lot. I think he's a good fighter. It's just kind of puzzling and a puzzling matchup.
That's why I said it felt like a fuck you from the UFC. Like, what else could be the source of this matchmaking it seems so puzzling to us. And other than like a clear statement that we're really not trying to build Aljamain Sterling the way he wants to be built.
Well, Sean Shelby does not like him, so
yeah, I know that. Yeah,
that is an actual true bit of insider knowledge from you.
So I just feel like, I mean, knowing that the DJ Borg / Nunes Shevchenko 2 situation after all of Dana's comments, I just don't ever really trust the UFC to have a lot of respect for like their fighters as people. So it feels like a doomed pairing for Aljamain Sterling. Do you also agree that it kind of is?
I think that if we took away a little bit of the last couple of years of context of both guys' careers, I still would think that this is a bad matchup for Sterling. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, like, I think Barao wins it. I don't know how much more there is to say beyond that.
Yeah, that's about it. Okay, well, that's our breakdown of UFC 214. Again, if you have not heard our discussion of the other main card fights, namely the welterweight championship bout between Tyron Woodley and Damian Maia, and the women's featherweight fight between Cyborg Justino, Chris Cyborg, rather, and Invicta women's bantamweight champ Tonya Evinger. Some big, meaningful, and somewhat bizarre fights there. We talked about those last week on last week's main show. Coming up soon this week will be a bonus episode in which we will recap the results of UFC on Fox 25, Weidman versus Gastelum. It was an absolutely gangbusters card, fun action from top to bottom, and we have plenty of stuff to talk about. So check us out on Patreon. That's Heavy Hands on Patreon. $3 a month gets you access to 2 or more bonus episodes every single month, and we do have a fun time doing them, and people seem to like them. So check us out on Patreon. Otherwise, thank you all for tuning in. Before we wrap up, I'm going to give Pat a chance to let you know what he's working on this week.
Not a whole lot. I should have one piece coming out for the Washington Post, pre-fight piece on Jones Cormier 2. Looking with GIFs, looking at how Cormier could go about winning this fight, what Jones has to do to stop him. And then I have a new episode of my new history show, The Tides of History. It's an interview with the senior editor of the New Republic magazine, Jeet here, talking about history in public, like how public history functions in public discourse, why it's useful, why it's not, what people are doing with it now. Yeah, I think it's a pretty decent interview. He's a sharp guy. So otherwise, that's about it. If you haven't already, check out the first 2 episodes of Tides of History. It's up on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, anywhere you can be looking for it. It's up there now, your podcast platform of choice.
Finished episode
check that out.
2. Finished episode 2 a couple days ago, man. It was really good. I mean, it was.
Thank you for listening, man.
Yeah, it's an upgraded Fall of Rome. If you guys like Fall of Rome, like it's Pat's same tone and style, but with like music and sound effects and a really, really nice sounding mic and what appears to be, based on the audio, a room with very little echo. So if you...
there's a real recording studio and there's a sound engineer and a sound designer and like there are producers and shit. It's wild.
It's a real podcast. How about working on disciplining that dog, Pat? Huh?
Yeah, well, she does what she wants.
How about that being a project for the next week? As for me, I don't know what the hell I'm doing. I'm working on the MMA Garage installment, looking at some of the fights that have taken place recently. I think I'll be looking at like Tomas Almeida, Khalil Roundtree, Gunnar Nelson, people who have had close fights or dramatic losses, or some of them maybe even who won and had things show up in their way. I want to point out the things that those people can add to their games or adjust in their games to make it easier for them to win going forward. There will be a full preview of UFC 214 coming very soon this week on Sherdog.com. That is also from me. And I have not yet decided on my topic, but I'll be working on a video essay, basically, a short video essay on Jones Cormier 2. So keep an eye out for that, MMANation.com, BloodyElbow.com, you know all the biz. Thank you guys for tuning in. We really appreciate you being here with us. Make sure to check us out on Patreon. Look for that other bonus episode, all those great fights that we had or will have a great time talking about. And until next time, thank you once again for showing up and downloading this little podcast of ours. If you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.